Good evening, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar, this MPART PFAS Town Hall for the Brighton Township Dump. Before we welcome our first presenter for the evening, I would like to go over a couple of webinar housekeeping items for you. While we're waiting for the slide to advance, just want to let you know that webinars are being recorded for later viewing, so you'll be able to share it with colleagues. We will send an email out or make notification to you all that the recording is available within the next day or so. The webinar lines are muted, but there's a way that you can have a conversation with our panel tonight. You will be able to use the Q&A box located in the bottom of your screen and the Zoom control panel to type in your question. You also will notice at the bottom of your screen a hand that you can raise during the question and answer session to raise your hand and let us know that you wish to speak to the panel directly. And for the panel tonight, so far we don't have anyone on the phone, but if we do, we will revisit that housekeeping item later in the webinar. So with that, Abby, if you are ready, the microphone and floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Les. Let's see if I can get these slides to advance. Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate your time. Tonight, coming out to talk with us about the Brighton Township Dump. I am Abigail Hendershot. I'm the MPART Executive Director, so Executive Director for the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. First, I just want to do some brief introductions so we can kind of run through an agenda and who's going to do what. I'm just going to do some introductions and an agenda overview. I'll go through a basic of what's PFAS, what's MPART, so you gotta have an idea of what's going on there. And then talk with Lisa Fisher, who is one of our toxicologists for Department of Health and Human Services. Rebecca Taylor from Eagle is going to talk through the investigation that's being done to date, and the PFAS sampling that's scheduled for residential drinking water wells. And then I'll come back and we'll talk about the MPART website where you can find the information and look at the information we already have on site for the Brighton Township Dump. And then we'll get into plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So as Les said, type your questions in the Q&A box as we go. We will get to them at the end and then you won't have to remember what you were thinking. So that's all very easy. All right, so let's get started. So what is MPART? Let's start with the basics. Michigan PFAS Action Response Team started actually under an executive order in 2017 with Governor Snyder, but endures as an executive order with Governor Whitmer as Executive Order 2019-03. It really establishes a unique multi-agency approach for handling PFAS. It's 7 different agencies that all come together to help coordinate and collaborate on PFAS actions at the state level of government. It also helps us coordinate our actions and our strategies for PFAS going up to the national level and to the local level, so we can bring you really coordinated messaging like we are tonight and implement actions much quicker than we were before. So what are PFAS? PFAS refers to the family of compounds of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Those are chemical structures, chemical bonds that are very strong because they are carbon-fluorine bonds. They're some of the strongest bonds that we know in chemistry, and they're very stable. They make great surfactants, so they repel the water, the oils, the fats, the greases. And we use them for all kinds of things in our household daily lives. But we kind of stumbled upon this science, this chemical formulation back in the late 1940s and have slowly gone through industrial uses and is now widespread in commercial uses through all of our personal, first world conveniences. So right now we know at least 5,000 chemicals, probably I've seen numbers up to 8,000 chemicals. It's a big grouping of PFAS with a PFAS really relates to the whole family of compounds. So some of the PFAS uses, as I said, are pretty diverse, pretty widespread through our society, including apparel, construction uses, pharmaceuticals, electronics, energy. The aqueous film forming foam, we will talk a little bit about today, but AFFF, as we call it, is a pretty big source of PFAS and has led to quite a bit of contamination. Semiconductors, Gore-Tex, your Teflon pans, your carpet in your floors. There are concentrations of PFAS in a lot of our daily use items. And so we all have levels of PFAS in our blood already. So what's the issue with that, right? Why are we really concerned about that? Part of the biggest issue is that we are finding PFAS in a lot of different locations. It's pretty widespread through our ecosystem, and it doesn't biodegrade. We don't see it breaking down very easily in our natural environment. But what we do see is that PFOS and PFOA, PFOS specifically, has a very high tendency to bioaccumulate in our bodies, bioaccumulate in our fish, and then once it gets into the food chain, can start working its way up. So that's very concerning for us. We also know that PFAS can affect health. There's still a lot more work to be done to understand the toxicological effects, but we know that it does have health concerns. We also know that we don't have national standards. The EPA and the national government has not made any standards for PFAS. It is not a hazardous substance yet under CERCLA. And so we're watching that to see when that might actually happen. The other thing that is really important for everybody to understand is we have this is what we call our PFAS cycle. And this PFAS cycle is such that you have a PFAS that may get into the ground from the PFAS producing industry and then end up in your wastewater treatment plant from that industry, maybe end up in the landfill, from any of those sources, might end up in the groundwater or in the river. And we have, all of that has the potential to get from the wastewater treatment plant into biosolids, which can also infiltrate into the groundwater. All of these are potential sources to groundwater, which we ultimately use for over 1 million homes in our state for drinking water. We also have the potential for PFAS to come through the air from certain processes as an air deposition to soils and then back to contaminating groundwater. The other special one here is the firefighting foam, which I said is something that can cause groundwater contamination very easily. And so that's something we are taking some special concerns with. The other thing that MPART has been doing is really doing widespread evaluation of our rivers and our streams, understanding fish. And so we've been doing pretty wide scale testing of surface water, fish, foam, wastewater, trying to get a better handle on the occurrence of PFAS in our surface and fish, really to identify and eliminate those types of sources. We also see foam that is found on our surface water bodies that can be found in pretty high concentrations of foam. Usually the surface water doesn't have the same concentrations, but that foam layer can be pretty high in concentrations. So that's all stuff that we are taking a close look at. The other thing that's really important for everyone to know is that Michigan does have drinking water standards for PFAS compounds. So 7 different compounds here have what we consider to be MCLs, maximum contaminant levels, which are then transferred over to groundwater cleanup criteria, which we'll talk about next. But these 7 compounds are considered Michigan drinking water standards under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which specifically applies to municipal drinking water sources. So if you get city water, this is the standards that your city water plant has to comply with to be in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act for the state of Michigan. In addition, as I said, those same compounds and same levels then all apply for groundwater cleanup criteria. And we've got, I'll show you 169 different sites around the state that are being investigated using those groundwater cleanup criteria as a benchmark. And so anything that has a concentration above those levels then is listed on this map as a site of PFAS contamination that's being investigated. So right now I said we have 169. This includes military installations, landfills, industrial sites, airports. We have a lot of different things on this list. But just because we have a very busy list or busy map here, it doesn't mean that Michigan is worse off than the rest of the country. It just means that we're really looking, we're really making a concentrated effort to understand where are the PFAS sources in our state, what does it mean, and how do we make sure that we're protecting our drinking water users and our recipient, or our residents of the state as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Fisher, who is going to talk to you some more about public health. So Lisa, I'm going to shut mine off and let you go, and I will advance the slides for you.
All right, great. So I'm Lisa Fisher. I'm a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the role of DHHS at PFAS investigation areas, and then talk about some of the health outcomes that are associated with PFAS. All right, so the role of MDHHS along with the local health department, in this case it would be the Livingston County Health Department, is to understand the health concerns that are facing the local community when it comes to investigating these sites of PFAS concern. So while EGLE leads the site investigation and they're the agency that's usually collecting the information, DHHS works with the local health department to figure out if there's any public health response actions that are warranted. And if there are, we'll recommend public health actions if needed. So like Abby mentioned, PFAS are everywhere. And there's many different ways that people can be exposed to PFAS. The main exposure pathway would be drinking contaminated water. Some other ways that people can be exposed to PFAS would include eating fish that come from water bodies that are contaminated with PFAS. If you go to the MPART webpage, there is a link there that has our Eat Safe Fish guidelines, and it'll show you all of the guidelines that we have across the state that are related to PFAS in fish. Some other ways that you can be exposed to PFAS would be accidentally swallowing soil or dust that's contaminated with PFAS, eating foods that have been packaged in materials that have PFAS, and then use of consumer products. And PFAS absorption through the skin is typically not a concern. The levels would have to be very elevated in water before skin contact would be an issue. And at levels that high, we would be more concerned about drinking the water than skin contact. So it's really not a huge surprise that most of us have some levels of PFAS in our blood. And you can see here, this is a chart that shows the blood levels of some common PFAS in Americans from the years 2000 to 2014. And what's interesting is that in 2002, the use and manufacture of PFOS and PFOA in the United States decreased, which you can see reflected in the blood levels between the years 2000 and 2004. However, manufacturers have replaced the use of PFOS and PFOA with other PFAS compounds that typically have a shorter half-life, which means they stay in the human body for less time. However, the science is still emerging on any health effects that are associated with those other PFAS compounds. So we know the most about PFOA and PFOS. So we do know that there are some health outcomes associated with exposure to those PFAS. And those include reduced fertility, preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure in pregnant women, decreases in infant birth weight, and then higher cholesterol, especially total and LDL. And then it's also linked with thyroid disease, liver damage, a decreased immune system response to vaccines, and for PFOA exposure, it's been associated with certain types of cancer, such as kidney and testicular cancers. And it's also important to note that, just because you were exposed to high levels of PFAS doesn't necessarily mean that you'll develop any of these health conditions. It just means, you're more likely to develop them than someone who wasn't exposed at high levels to PFAS. So when we're looking at the data that Eagle collects, something that we look a lot at is residential well water results. So we'll look at those well water results both for an individual home and collectively. So all of the well results that were sampled in an area. And we want to know if there are any well water results that exceed our MDHHS comparison values, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then we also want to know any site-specific information that might be relevant to protecting public health. So that would be looking at known sources, geology. I think I've got a slide coming up. I can touch more on that in a bit. So the MDHHS comparison values are the lowest of two different health-based screening levels. And what I mean by health-based screening level is they're set to protect everyone, including sensitive populations. So in this case for PFAS, those sensitive populations would include fetuses and breastfed babies. And then this is just a table that shows what the comparison values are. Let's see. Yep. So Rebecca's going to talk about this later, but we are going to be, or Eagle is going to be collecting residential well water and testing them for PFAS. And so like I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at individual homes results and determining whether public health actions are necessary partially based on those water results. So for example, typically any home or any result that is above one of our comparison values, we typically provide a point of use filter or some sort of alternate water as an interim measure. But we also like to look at the data collectively for some different scenarios that we may run into. So if you look at the diagram towards the right, we have a house in the middle that doesn't exceed our comparison values, but it's surrounded by homes that do. So in that case, we would probably offer that home in the middle a point of use filter, just as an extra precaution as the investigation is ongoing, in case those levels fluctuate over time. For a lot of these sites, the investigation, is ongoing. We don't know everything about the site yet, so we just want to have an extra layer of protection for those homeowners. And then if we look to the diagram to the left, we have that same house that's below the comparison values, and then it's surrounded by other homes that are less than the comparison values or maybe don't have any detections of PFAS. In that case, we may not offer them a filter. If there's any other information that Eagle collects where maybe we think they might be impacted or impacted in the future, then we may offer them a point of use filter or recommend alternate water. So it kind of just depends. And then on the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the other information that we look at as well. So Eagle is going to be looking at, is there a known or suspected PFAS source in the area? What's the local geology like? So are there a lot of shallow wells or deeper wells? Typically shallower wells are more prone to contamination issues in general. That seems to be true for PFAS as well. And then, what is the lithology, or what does the ground look like? Is it more sandy where contaminants can get into an aquifer more easily, or is there a clay barrier that might prevent contaminants from moving down into the aquifer? And then something else that we're always interested in knowing is whether there's a groundwater plume of contamination. And this might tell us, homes that might be down gradient of this plume that may be impacted, but maybe we haven't, tested their water yet. It may give us, what's the word? It'll help us look for other homes that may be impacted so that we can provide them the appropriate public health measures. Yeah, so if the well water results come back and the PFAS levels are non-detect or below comparison values, and there's no other information that Eagle collects that kind of gives us pause for concern, we may determine that no public health actions are necessary. I've mentioned a point of use filter. We may recommend that or offer it. It's an interim measure while the investigation is ongoing, and it provides residents with a level of protection while we collect more information as the investigation continues. And then we also provide a lot of educational materials and fact sheets that provide information about PFAS in drinking water. And then I just wanted to touch on the fish consumption guidelines that we have for a nearby lake, Moraine Lake. So fish were collected from Moraine Lake back in 2018. And you can see here, so I have PFOS listed. PFOS is the PFAS that's most commonly detected in fish tissue. We do test for other PFAS in fish, but that's the one that we're most concerned about. Oop. Can you move the slide back? Okay, so you can see that PFOS is listed along with mercury for the bluegill sunfish and the smaller crappie. But if you look to the right where we have the Michigan servings per month, those fish are listed at 16 servings per month. So to put that in perspective, we don't calculate an unlimited consumption servings per month category. We only go up to 16 servings per month, it's a lot of fish. So that's kind of our upper end. So to say that it's at 16 servings per month because of mercury and PFOS, that basically means that those levels were really low in those fish. And then you can see for the larger crappie and the largemouth and smallmouth bass, PFOS levels were not a concern, and it was actually mercury that is driving the guideline there. So I think that's all I have, and I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Taylor. I'm with Lansing District Office of Eagle Remediation Redevelopment Division, and I've been a project manager for Brighton Township Dump for a few years. And I've been out there a few times with the consultant with the township. So I've also met some of you when I was handing out information about the dump and our desire to collect some free PFAS samples. So I'm just giving you a background of the dump and some of its geologic characteristics and the sampling that we've done to evaluate PFAS at this location. So Brighton Township Dump has been around for a while, and back in the day when dumps were poorly regulated, they accepted waste in the 1960s into the 1970s. And some of those wastes were industrial related. EPA removed numerous drums, about 200 of them, from a ravine and pit in the upper part of the dump near Corlett Drive. And then in 2002, Eagle removed some sludges that were near the wetlands, right next to the wetlands, costing, we spent state money, the federal government spent state money to remove these wastes. So as a result of the costs that the state incurred, We negotiated with Brighton Township, entered with a consent decree to evaluate the known contamination at the dump. That would include volatile organics, metals, and methane coming from the dump, and some other chemicals as well. But the consent decree did not address emerging contaminant like PFAS. So part of the consent decree was to sample area residential wells, the ones that are surrounding the landfill, for volatile organic compounds, basically chemicals you can often smell, or sometimes you can't smell, but they're volatile and they have different impacts for different chemicals. So these wells were sampled for numerous years, and no volatile organic compounds were found in any of the residential wells. And I'll get into the probable reason of that later. But the residential well sampling stopped by the consent decree in 2019. So if you're a resident in the area and you haven't received any news of 2020 sampling, it's because it didn't happen, because the requirement is ended for the township for that sampling. So part of the agreement with the township was to restrict groundwater use on the property, which is now tax reverted to the state of Michigan, and not to use groundwater. And there's some other restrictions that apply too. There's a 8-foot fence surrounding the property to keep people from going into the property, and the cover material that is covering what waste is left behind, or to prevent infiltration, excess infiltration into the groundwater. That's part of the responsibility of the township right now. And the groundwater use was restricted by ordinance for properties that the township did not have some control over, in one property to the east and another one south by the wetlands. But those restrictions don't include the use of the private wells, which are deep. So they restrict the shallow zones basically, or certain sections of the property that don't impact the use of the property by the people who live there. So next slide. So this particular slide shows the dump, and Corlett Drive is near the gate. And you'll see this wetland to the south that has some open water associated with it. And the topography is pretty high towards Corlett Drive. And there's, you can see a slice in where the trees are. It's sort of the ravine pit area where some of the drums are pulled out by the EPA. And then if you go to the south, and you see this open green area next to the pond, not that one, go further up to the cursor, there you go. That's where a lot of sludges were disposed, and basically all stuff rolls downhill kind of a thing, where waste are burned and sludges were dumped towards the margins of the wetlands. So that was a contaminated area where the state removed a lot of waste materials. And as a result of where the worst contamination was located, that pretty much dictated where a lot of the monitoring wells went. So we can go to the next slide. So monitoring wells are placed in a landfill or other locations at different depth intervals where sand units are located, to get an idea of what's in the groundwater from contamination and where that groundwater is going, the direction it flows. So the two maps you see in front of you are two different zones of groundwater looked at the dump. There's actually 3 zones. We just didn't post the shallow zone. The one to the right is the deeper zone, and that's about at 40 to 50 feet thereabouts, sometimes depending on where you are, because there's a 40-foot drop from north to south in this landfill. But anyhow, the deeper wells are in a deeper sand unit. The intermediate wells to the left are in a middle sand unit, say about 20, 30 feet deep. And then the shallow zone can be only 6 feet deep near the wetlands. And so groundwater is going in different directions for each of those zones. And so that we take into consideration when we look at which residential wells may be at risk for migrating contamination. And PFAS, the materials that were put in this landfill were put in many years ago. The good thing about groundwater is it doesn't move super fast, especially if your geology is not just a bunch of fluffy sand. So it takes a long time for contamination to move from, for a mile or something like that. A lot of times contamination never makes a mile. So next slide. So what Eagle did is that we evaluated numerous sites we thought may be at risk for having PFAS above our drinking water criteria. And we looked at the condition of the landfill and the type of waste it accepted and the remediation that was done. And we decided that there may be PFAS at this location. So in 2020, while the consultant was sampling for just volatile organic compounds per the consent decree, Eagle staff collected what we call split samples. In other words, we had a sampling container we could take to a lab for PFAS, and we used the equipment that the consultant was using to collect their samples. So basically, we were looking for a different thing than the consultant was looking for. So they were only obliged to look at 5 monitoring wells at the time, and so we collected 5 samples, all of them close to the wetlands. So 3 of those 5 wells did have PFOA or PFOS. Those are the 2 PFAS compounds that are regulated under our environmental cleanup law. And so then the site became an MPART site because those 3 monitoring wells were above our cleanup criteria. We had a town hall way back last year in August. It is a group with a regional town hall we had for our entire district. And that was last year. Next slide. So after we found that there was indeed PFAS above our criteria at the southern end of the landfill near the wetlands, we decided to look for what's going on at the entire landfill, or at least most of the area. So we looked at different monitoring wells in the shallow, intermediate, and deep zones to see what was there for PFAS, and then we resampled the wetland wells that we had sampled before, and for comparison purposes to see if the concentrations changed seasonally, and to also look at 2 different labs to see if there's differences between the labs. So we did that, and then next slide. We did find PFOS in higher concentrations near the wetlands in a different well that wasn't sampled previously. And PFOA was also present in the well at 26 parts per trillion, at the same well that had PFOS at 170. That was sort of in the middle of the cleanup zone, and that's where that was located. But we did find an upland well that did have PFOS at 22 parts per trillion, which is over the criteria, in an upland well, and then a deeper well that's really close to the property line near the residences. That was about a little over halfway towards the criteria, but it was there at about 40, 50 feet depth. So one of the things we do look at with the groundwater is both which way the groundwater is flowing, and is the pressure on the groundwater pushing the groundwater down, which means the contamination would tend to go down, or is it tending to discharge to a lake? So those are some of the things we look at in terms of risk of contaminants moving from one place to another. Next slide. So this map here, and I did hand that out to a few people who live in the area when I was handing out materials and asking for permission to sample wells. But this shows the monitoring wells that are on the property. You'll note that there's big clusters of monitoring wells to the south. that have the most red and yellow dots. And the red and yellow dots are where PFOS or PFOA exceed the drinking water and the state cleanup criteria. And to the north, there's just one that exceeded the criteria, but there's PFAS present in a lot of the other monitoring wells. So it's there. And so at the time we sampled in October, this is what we found. So we know it's present in the landfill. We know it seems to be associated with the old waste disposal areas. You'll notice there's a lot of big space where there are no monitoring wells that, we're looking at whether or not that is enough of an issue or not regarding evaluating risk. So we do have a big pile of monitoring wells to look at different depths. So remember, you're looking at different depth intervals as well as where they're located. And all that information is put together to evaluate the source strength of PFAS that may be migrating. So there is groundwater movement to the northwest is the predominant direction. There's groundwater movement a little bit to the west-northwest. There is, in the shallow wells, some movement near the wetlands towards the east. So because of that, we decided that it would be beneficial to virtually circle the landfill with residences and just sample everybody around the landfill, basically, and concentrate our efforts on residences that are located to the northwest, which is the predominant direction of groundwater flow. And most of the residential wells in the area are between about 57 feet and 124 feet deep. And there are multiple clay layers that are between where the contamination is located and where those drinking water wells are, at least in most cases. So there's some protection from the contamination. And we do know that volatile organic compounds are not found in any of these wells earlier. So we have a pretty high confidence that we're not going to see any PFAS, but we're not entirely certain. PFAS does travel in the environment differently than volatile organic compounds and metals and things like that. So if there is a couple wells out there that are fairly shallow, and I believe there's even one that was installed in such a way that it wasn't grouted, that is less protection from shallower zone contamination. So that's why we're interested in collecting the free PFAS sample at no cost to you. And, frankly, if, you don't know, then maybe, you might worry about it. So this is a way to get true information about whether or not there's any contamination that may have migrated towards your well. So basically the red circle areas there show where the PFAS is located at the landfill, and the blue dots show the areas that we asked people to grant access to. There's one property that I missed the blue dot with at 023, but that was also, that's in the request area. So next slide. So a concern with the PFOS near the wetlands is that it's bioaccumulative, and wildlife and environmental biota might be harmed by it. And right now we have not collected any surface water samples, but if you look at that map, it's a little bit hard to make out. But if you see the little light gray area, that's GM Proving Grounds. And then you see Moraine Lake, which is immediately to the west. And if you proceed to the west a little bit more, and there's Hine Road, I think is a really light, but basically west of Moraine Lake is where the dump is. And it appears that groundwater is heading to a tributary of Woodruff Creek that is to the west side of that map. So it's pretty much in the center of that sub-drainage area of the Huron River. So because the PFOS was at 170 parts per trillion in a shallow monitoring well, that means it's probably getting into the wetlands. We have plans to collect some surface water samples later on. So next slide. So this just shows what Water Division has done in the Huron River area. So they did go to Man Creek and they collected some samples, some surface water samples for PFOS and PFOA, unless it's posted there. And you'll notice that in near the center, near that red dot, there was one sample that came back fairly high for PFOS. But when it was resampled, that same location, nothing showed up. And they did collect the fish from Moraine Lake, possibly because of that detection, and then they found a little bit of PFOS in the surface water. So at the end of the day, there is some PFOS out there that is not related to the dump at all. It's a whole different drainage system, and I don't know if any samples have been collected in the tributary creek. Frankly, that would be a long way for any PFOS or PFOA from the dump to migrate to. It would basically attenuate out by then. Next slide. There's one more. And the city of Brighton does sample its drinking water frequently. And it was last sampled in January 2021. There is no PFAS detected. And they're monitoring their drinking water supply every year. So the next slide is next steps of what we plan on doing. So we do wish to sample residential wells surrounding the landfill. We're hoping that people who have been given access agreements will let us collect samples. Basically, we just go to the outside spigot. We have a contractor do that. I hardly know that we're there, and just collect a water sample, send it to our Eagle lab, and then results come back in about 3 weeks later. And then after they're reviewed for a short period, we let the residents know, and if there's an issue, we immediately let them know about whether or not what the PFAS levels are in their well. And if we do find there is an issue out there, then we may be expanding our study area to make sure that we get to a point where there's no residential wells impacted in any way in the area. So this is the first phase, and it may end here if we find no PFAS. And typically, if we don't find PFAS, we may not be coming back unless we have a reason to come back based on what we're seeing at the landfill. And so at the landfill, it's actually a dump. We're sampling for surface water this summer, and then we'll be resampling the monitoring wells in the fall. And this is to get us an idea of how consistent the PFAS levels are in the monitoring wells. Typically, at a dump at this age, the PFAS levels will hold fairly consistent, and over time, contamination has declined greatly over time in this dump. So it's actually on the tail end of being a problem. So with regards to the collection of information, we will keep doing that. And basically, as the information comes in and as it's evaluated, extra new steps may be called for. But this is what we think is going to happen in the near term. So with regard to the consent decree that Brighton Township is involved with, which is still going, it's not terminated yet. And we have a new issue with PFAS, so we've engaged with the township regarding PFAS responsibilities. So we will continue to engage with the township regarding this. But in the meantime, Eagle is doing work that needs to be done to address the issue.
Thank you, Rebecca. Les, you want to remind our attendees how they can submit questions?
Absolutely. Since the housekeeping was provided earlier at the start of the webinar, we've had three additional, we have three attendees listening by phone only. So for our three guests who are listening by phone, if you have a question for the panel, you can electronically raise your hand by selecting the pound and the 2 key on your phone, and that will electronically raise your hand. We'll see you and unmute your line so you can ask your question of the panel. We do have some questions that have come in, so those of you who have questions, please feel free to go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom, and there is an option also for you to electronically raise your hand there as well. And if the panel is ready, we can start tackling the questions that have come in from the start of the questions related to PFAS for this conversation this evening, if you are all ready.
Yeah.
All right. This question, one of our attendees is concerned about the soil and gardening. This is, what about the contamination in soil? Are my kids digging in it? My kids dig in it and we plant a garden. Is this a concern?
You want me to take that one?
Now, why don't
they-
you address it from the on-site versus off-site? That would be great, Rebecca.
Right, so on-site soils are within the landfill. What's left that's contaminated can contribute to the groundwater. And that soil's got cover on it. There's heavy vegetation. Those soils aren't going to be blowing around to the neighborhood at all. And the contamination would be below that top layer anyhow. So there would be no risk from anything blowing off the landfill or even runoff. There's not much erosion of any kind coming from the old dump, then of concern, and everything, if there was any erosion, head to the wetlands anyhow, but I haven't seen any signs of erosion. So vegetation is holding the soil very nicely. And as far as off property, I'm not believing there's much of an issue, because back in the day when those wastes were excavated out, measures were taken to prevent contamination from flying around in the dust and going off property. So I wouldn't consider it a concern at all, really.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Next question. The question is, one of our attendees wants to know, they weren't aware that there was an issue in the area when they moved in. There's no time reference for when they moved in. Can you kind of touch on that a little bit, Rebecca, about how long just kind of summarize the period of which we became aware that there was a PFAS issue here?
PFAS, we became aware of it in July of 2020, basically. It became an MPART site in July. We took samples in May, and then we got the results back. I think it was late June. So it's only been about a year since we've known there's any PFAS out there at all. And then we needed to do more work to confirm that it was an issue, and where it was located, and whether or not it posed a risk to anybody.
Okay.
And Rebecca, how long is the duration of the Brighton Township dump overall been going on? Do you know?
Well, the dump was operating in the 60s and closed in the early 70s, and probably received waste before then. And the EPA became involved with the first cleanup effort way back in 1990. They removed those drums. And then later on, Eagle became involved and did some more evaluation work and found other hot contamination zones near the wetlands, and dug trenches and such, and got rid of that. So it's been a long time that dump's been out there, and I'm not sure how long that fence has been out there, but it's been out there for a long time. Big fence around the landfill, the old dump.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next question, attendee has concerns about the testing in the area. I am closely outside the border and would like my well to be tested, but I feel like I shouldn't have to pay for this. Can I ask for my well to be tested?
So Rebecca, normally if we have somebody who's outside of a sampling area, we request to take their name and number. And then if the data shows that we have to step out, we have their contact information to talk to them right away. I'm assuming since we are kind of doing this as precautionary sampling, that it would still be a good idea for this attendee to provide their name and email address, phone number, so that we can get a hold of them if we need to contact them, if the data shows that we need to step out from these initial houses. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I've got my contact information, and welcome to send me an email, and we'll take your information and we'll keep you advised as to what the progress is with what we find. And also the MPART site does get updated periodically as to what the findings are.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Abby. Lisa, we have a question about point of use filters. About what is a point of use filter?
Yeah, so a point of use filter is basically, it's a filter. We choose one that's certified to reduce PFAS, and it goes under your kitchen sink. So that's why it's called a point of use, because it's not a whole house filter. So it's just a filter with a couple of cartridges that has granular activated carbon, and it goes underneath your kitchen sink. And then there's like a little tap that will come out of not like your main kitchen faucet, but it'll be like a little tap next to it. That'll be the filtered water that comes out of the point of use filter.
Thanks, Lisa. Next question. This question concerns categorizing the pollution at the Brighton Township dump. Isn't it premature for Eagle to state the Brighton Township dump pollution is near the end, given the PFOS, PFAS contaminants are very persistent?
I'm not sure what's meant by very thin, but the contamination at the dump, since the big waste issues were removed years ago, has dropped considerably. As part of the consent decree, monitoring wells were checked for volatile organic compounds primarily, and sometimes metals. And over the years, the concentrations have decreased dramatically. And so there's an issue with contaminants over criteria for volatiles in the wetland area. And that's why the consultant is only looking at 5 monitoring wells right now.
I
Okay.
think also, Rebecca, wouldn't it be fair to say that given the way this waste was deposited there, it wasn't like it was dumped in a lined landfill. It was kind of dumped haphazardly on top of the soils. So when it was removed as the sources, we had that initial source removal that was done. That's really going to decrease the amount of consistent and persistent sources of any contamination getting in there. So at this point, we don't even know if PFAS is even really there to a significant source. We just had a couple of wells that showed some contamination, but I think what this particular question is getting to is just if it's already in the groundwater, you're not expecting it to suddenly disappear or dissipate quickly. It's just that we don't think that the area of contamination is very big. I think that's what you were trying to get to with your description of your, thinking of the future of what this data is going to actually show when you get the results.
Well, when we compared the 5 monitoring well samples that were collected at 2 different time periods, May and October of last year, the concentrations are very similar for each of the wells. They didn't change very much. So for that brief period of comparison, we're not seeing a lot of variability in the concentrations of PFAS so far. And that's why we keep looking, is to make sure that we don't see spikes or something leaching out from somewhere that might cause a problem. But so far we haven't seen it.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. With regards to previous sampling, was testing performed for PFOS and PFOA on previous tap water samples?
No, that's why we like to do it now.
Has the source of the contamination been determined at the dump?
We think we've got a pretty good idea of where the contamination was. Early on, post-closure of that dump, EPA did a big walkover and they took a lot of samples to evaluate the condition of the property and decided that the ravine / pit area in the north central part was the most pressing concern and where they spending federal dollars to remove, and so they did. And then Eagle, after the EPA left, then Eagle became aware of the issue and started our own evaluation and did find the area worthy of removal near the wetlands. And actually, when you look at the map and you see that big smooth area, that's pretty much the general area where the removal was done. I mean, the vegetation has been gone for a while. A lot of monitoring wells out there in that spot.
All right, so Rebecca, there's another question. I'm not sure if this is related to the area you're referring to. The question from one of our attendees is, the township had a bulldozer working on this site last year. Could this have disturbed the contaminants on the property?
Well, one of the things that the township is responsible for is maintaining the condition of the perimeter fence. And the report showed a big oak tree had fallen on part of that fence. So they more likely than not needed a bulldozer to deal with that big oak tree because it was on the fence. They had to get it off the fence and cut it up.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Another question about filters. Where can we apply for a whole house carbon block filter? I don't want a point of use filter. So what are the other options available?
Lisa, you want to take that one? Or do you want
Yeah,
me to?
sure. So we provide a point of use filter at no charge. Currently, we're not providing whole house filters. That would be something you'd have to purchase on your own. I do understand, a point of use filter, only goes at one tap, but that's what we're doing right now. And it's just a interim precautionary measure at this point.
Okay.
And they are good for up to 1,500. I think it's 1,500 parts per trillion PFOA, PFOS certified for that removal in drinking water. So, and we've been using them for several years now, and they've been very effective. DHHS has been doing follow-up testing and has demonstrated long-term efficacy of removal of these compounds for more than just PFOA and PFOS as well, but they've been demonstrated to be very effective.
Okay.
Yeah, and we provide the replacement cartridges for those filters as well while the investigation is ongoing. So it's not like you're just going to get, one cartridge and then, be on the hook for replacement cartridges. We provide those as well.
Okay. Next question. An attendee lives in the Harvest Hill subdivision just south of Spencer Road. Should we be testing our common well for PFAS and PFOS? And if yes, how often?
Is this a community well? I'm not with drinking water. I'm just asking a question. Is that a community well that they're talking about?
If it's a type 2 well under the drinking water program, so if it's a community well, if he talks about a common well for a whole subdivision, which is considered a type 2 community water supply, then that's already being tested on a regular basis. All the type 1, type 2 community water supplies have been tested already for the state. And if there were any PFAS detections found, then they had to take measures to either put it on some treatment or figure out a new way to get water source that didn't contain PFAS. And so I don't know the actual data for this particular one, but assuming that it is a community water supply well, we would have data already for it.
And that data is available on the MPART website.
You read my mind, Lisa. Thanks. Perfect. That's exactly what I was going to say. And it's on available. And I can show everybody here in a minute. We can take a run through the MPART website that apparently I forgot to do at the end.
Okay. Next question concerns an attendee who lives approximately 1,200 feet south of the area of contamination. They would like their well tested. And they want to know if Brighton Analytical is testing for PFAS.
Basically, we're not looking at any residential wells on Newman Road, which is south of the landfill, the old dump, because groundwater is not going in that direction at all.
Okay.
So right now we're not including those areas based on the information we have.
So if the attendee is uncomfortable with that or wants to do something sooner, I'm bringing up this MPART webpage that we have. There are, so if you type in MPART, M-P-A-R-T, into your Google browser, you will come up with our homepage. And there is a whole list of PFAS in drinking water for private residential residential well owners, a whole bunch of information there, as well as laboratories offering home testing. They're about $250 to $300 for a test for your drinking water well. But if you want to wait and see what this first round of data says, again, send your information to Rebecca and we will put you on a list. If it looks like we need to move south or we need to move out in any one direction, we will definitely contact you. But if you want to do it yourself, that's fine too. There are certified laboratories that are doing drinking water testing. I don't know off the top of my head if Brighton Analytical is on that list, but there's probably 10 or 15 on this list right now. So come to the MPART website and check this out.
Okay.
Abby, does the Eagle Drinking Water Lab have kits? I thought we did.
We do. If we go to this laboratories, are you guys still seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So if you go to the laboratories offering home testing, you've got a download here that you can download, and yes, the Eagle Lab is actually on there, as is Merit, Northern Lake Service, Paragon, Kreiner Newhoff, RTI, Trace, Trident, and they will all send you like a home kit so you can do it yourself, take the sample, send it back to their lab, and they will do the analysis and send you the certified results.
I just want to say one thing. One of the things that do come up with low levels of PFAS is sometimes because of people's using commercial products of PFAS, they wash your dishes or whatever, it may end up in your septic system. Mm-hmm. So if your residential well is located far away from your septic system, it should be okay. But sometimes that may be a source of really low levels of PFAS is what gets in the septic system.
Mm-hmm. And I see there's another question on a point of use filter. I'm just looking to see if we've got some home filter. I thought maybe we had a picture of one. And I don't, maybe Bill knows where we've got a picture of the PFAS filters that we normally put in our thing. So we can grab, but again, if you want to, I see one of our attendees is asking about obtaining a point of use filter. I am not in a sampling area, although I was very close to a sampling area, kind of like you guys are. And Aquasana is the kind that I bought. And for, I think it was $250, $300. I got the whole little kit. It came with the 3-stage filter. And then my husband just attached it under the kitchen sink, and we took off the soap dispenser and put the little spigot for the water. Pretty easy. You reorder the filters every 6 months because you don't want bacterial growth. It's not that it really stops working for PFAS. It's just that At that point, you have the potential for bacterial growth. So manufacturer recommendations is every 6 months and the thing that I like about this is it's good for things other than PFAS. Additionally, it covers metals and it covers volatile organic compounds as well as a few other things. And so it's got a broad range of removal capacity, including PFAS. But if you're going to buy one, you want to make sure that it's certified to remove PFAS, but it will do other things as well. So we can put that information in the chat. I'll grab it and we'll stick it in the chat so you guys have that information.
Okay. Next question. Okay. Question is from one of our attendees is how big of a problem is PFAS contamination in surface water in the pond? Is migration faster?
Well, one of the things we're going to find out what's in that pond. It's basically a wetland with a margin around the margins. It looks like it used to be a pond that was filled in partly with either a bog or just natural materials. But in any case, there is some open water there, and you can see it. This is a dark area around the edge of it, and most of the open water is close to where the old dump was. So be collecting samples just around the edge there, and if we get permission to go over to somebody's property and collect over there too, and make sure that there's just not anything that may harm the aquatic environment. And Lisa can talk about the dermal contact, which is not really an issue. It's more drinking. I don't think anybody's going to drink that pond water. But the aquatic invertebrates and if there's any fish there, frogs or whatnot, they live there. So we just want to see if there's an ecological risk.
Thanks, Rebecca. Another question concerns the PFOA allowable levels for human consumption. Who sets the PFOA allowable levels for human consumption, and how long have there been studies ongoing on the effects of PFOS on humans?
Okay, I'm going to let Lisa take that one. I'm assuming they might be talking about fish consumptions for the allowable levels for human consumption. That might be a fish-related question.
Okay, yeah. If we're talking about fish, we're not concerned if fish have below 9 parts per billion of PFOS. There's currently, we don't have a fish consumption recommendation for PFOA. We do see it in fish sometimes, but it's never to a level that would warrant any sort of guideline. But it is something that we test for and keep an eye on if you're talking about fish consumption. And then what was the other half of that question?
The other half is, how long have there been studies ongoing on the effects of PFOS on humans?
Okay. Yeah, we consider PFAS, we kind of call it a contaminant of emerging concern, not because it's a new contaminant, but because the science is so new around it. So I would say probably in the past 10 years, the scientific literature has really picked up on PFAS. So, I mean, we know a remarkable, we've really learned a lot in the past 10 years or so, but there's still a lot to learn. So yeah, I would say it's really picked up in the past 10 years.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. Another question. Oh, okay. The question about the filter, the water filter. What is the percentage of PFOS that could still come through the point of use filter?
And I'm trying to remember the percentage and Abby, maybe was it like 96% effective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, they're certified to remove 96% of PFOA and PFOS, as Abby said, up to 1,500 parts per trillion. But I will note that DHHS has been conducting resampling of PFAS sites across the state. As part of those resampling efforts, we are also collecting post-filter samples from residents where we've provided point of view filters. And we're finding that the filters are very effective in removing not only PFOA and PFOS, but other PFAS that are present in the water. So that the data that we're getting is very encouraging as to the effectiveness of the point of use filters in removing the PFAS in drinking water wells that we're seeing at sites across the state.
And can I ask a question about maintenance of the filters? How long can they go without changing out the filter material?
So it depends on water use, but typically I think the manufacturer says about 6 months, and then it also gives 6 months or like this many gallons used. And then the filters have a light that turns red when the filter needs to be changed.
They have end of life indicators. So they let you know when the cartridge needs to be changed.
Lisa or Bill, I'm sure this came up earlier, but just to reiterate, not all water filters can address PFOS and PFOA. Can you just touch on what the attendees should look for on a water filter?
Yeah, and Bill can chime in too, but you want to look for a certification that's ANSI. The old
53
one was P473, but I think now it's 53. Bill, is that changed recently?
That's correct. And when you like you can purchase point of use filters at Home Depot but what you do is when you look at purchasing a filter, what you want to do is you want to try and Google and get the specification sheet, and that tells you what the particular filter is certified to remove. And if you're talking about PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, it'll say ANSI 53 PFOA certified. So that's the certification. That's kind of the indicator that you want to look for to make sure that you're getting a filter that's certified to remove PFOA and PFOS.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Lisa. Next question is, we have an attendee who is on Parmalee Lane. Should anyone living on Parmalee Lane be concerned about having their water tested?
Yes, if you look at the blue dots there, so the ones on the east side, that's all Parmalee Lane. And the one on the north, it's all on the east side, that's Parmalee Lane. So there's four residences that we're looking at right now. And we left access requests, sample access requests, letters there if the person wasn't home, rubber band to the doorknob. So yes, there are those residences that we're looking at. It's not exactly the direction of groundwater flow, but it's right next to the landfill. And there was a slight easterly component in the shallow groundwater flow to the south part of the landfill, the old dump. And so and there were 2 monitoring wells next to a residence on Parmalee that did have some PFOS and PFOA in them below criteria. So we're hoping that resident will allow us to sample their well. There was no volatile organic compounds, and they do have a deep well, so that's the good thing.
Abby, I want to switch gears here. Catch a hand over here
Sure.
from one of our attendees. Okay, ask to unmute.
Jana?
Mr. Buchanan?
Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Hold on. Dennis, he wants to talk to you. He had me on mute. I'm sorry I opened that. The gentleman with the, right here. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Do you have a question for the panel?
Well, my question was, I wrote it, I sent it in, but why did Brighton Township refuse to get into the investigation with you?
Well, we did send them a notification letter stating, yes, there is PFAS at the old dump above our criteria, and yes, we believe you to be responsible to evaluate and address the issue. And we gave the township basically a work plan that we'd like them to do, and they decided to not do anything at this time. So that's why we're doing work, and we will continue to engage with the township with regard to their responsibilities to address this issue. One of the complicating factors is the fact that they do have an existing consent decree with us that they'd like to complete for other contamination. So I don't know what the township is thinking. I do know that we provided notice. They weren't eager to do work at this time, but we will continue to engage with them regarding the work that may or may not need to be done in the future.
So they actually gave no reason then? Is that correct?
They said they believe they weren't liable. That's what they said in their letter.
Okay, thank you.
And I will just add to that, often these situations like this one are pretty sticky. You know, they often take time to resolve. It may involve lawyers, it may involve enforcement actions. We don't want to wait to get this question answered about whether or not we have anybody out here who might be at risk for PFAS. So often the state will step in, do the immediate drinking water sampling analysis, find out whether or not we have a risk to public health, and then go back and talk to the township further about ongoing obligations and what those next steps might look like once that question is resolved. Because just because we're doing this phase of sampling doesn't mean that we aren't going to continue to pursue discussions with Brighton Township Dump about their obligations. I don't want anybody to think that we've given up on that avenue. It's just that this is a question that we think it needs an immediate answer. So we've taken to doing this sampling to make sure we get these answers for your public health, so that we can move on and have those longer, sometimes stickier conversations with our liable parties. Hopefully that helps.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to put in there is that in their reply letter, Brighton Township is continuing to cooperate us. I mean, they have the keys to the gate and everything, and they let us in, and we're welcome. They let us know when they do work, and so we've been cooperating with the township for years now, and they will continue to cooperate with what we're doing at the landfill for PFAS investigation. They're not going to throw any barriers to what we're doing. They're being very helpful.
Next question. There's a question about what was exactly dumped at the Brighton Township dump.
Well, being an old dump, it can be a number of things, but some of the early inspection reports showed what they call white goods, old appliances and things like that were piled up until they could be scrapped out. And there was some municipal, garbage type stuff going in there. And that produces some methane. So there wasn't a methane evaluation years ago. And it turned out there was very little methane that's in the groundwater or, venting out of the old dump. There's not much at all. And you never know everything that's put into an old dump. We do know that they were burning waste materials near the margin of that wetland. We do know that some, trouble with wetlands is they tend to attract a bunch of junk, and it's things that get plowed down the hill. And you can see some of those old access roads, and where there's an access road, there's usually a place where folks were depositing materials. There are a few kind of depressions and pits out there. that may have received some waste. But if you were to walk out there today, you wouldn't see much of anything. Everything's covered up. And, you know, what happened in the past is all we got is the old inspection reports to figure out what went into that, the old dump. But mainly it was used by the local residents, and there were some occasional intrusions by of industrial waste, obviously, over the years. And so that has been removed. And as far as what's left, if it's some materials that residents put in there, it's not all that much as far as contamination.
Thanks, Rebecca.
And as Abby said, most of that stuff was at the surface, not a whole lot buried. The difference between a dump and a landfill is that, you know, dump is you're putting things in convenient spots. A landfill is engineered, you have cells and, you know, and routines of covering and maintaining. A dump is sort of helter-skelter at the surface. It's typically how it works.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. In terms of the property, you mentioned in your presentation that the property tax reverted to the state. Yes. Okay.
The actual property owner was not Brighton Township. It was owned by another family, and they did not pay their taxes and it tax reverted. And the person who owned that property and operated it has been dead for a while.
Okay. Next question. Actually, I want to go to another hand raised. Mr. Palmer, you have a question for the panel?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just a couple quick questions. In 2009, the consent decree, and it's a red flag to me. It shows that rather than the supervisor at the time, the clerk Ann Bolin, who is now a legislator in Lansing, was the only person to sign the consent decree in 2009 as the clerk. You know, I'm wondering if that causes problems or any kind of plausible deniability that they agreed to the actual consent agreement. And secondly, has Eagle approached the two legislatures that had this mess in their lap in 2009, which is Lana Thies and Ann Bolin, who now work out of Lansing as legislators, to get more in depth on what actually took place back in 2009? Because it just seems like a fiasco. I've read Eagle's letter of April 19th a dozen times. I've read the response of May 3rd from Brighton Township, which they're denying liability. But yet it's like you're going back to square one to 2009, trying to figure out and put the puzzle together. How close are you to remedy the situation? And does Brighton Township suggest that they're going to get water, clean water, to those families in the red zone or the blue zone if PFAS become more prominent? Thank you.
Well, you're asking a legal question. As a project manager, I'm not really equipped to answer a legal question. I do know that the consent decree was entered in the court of law and is binding upon the parties. And that's the bottom line for me. And as far as the PFAS issue, we're going to continue to engage with the township. With regard to that, unfortunately, the consent decree is written in such a way that when it was reviewed by the Attorney General's office, it was decided that we better start from square one, and that's exactly what we did.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca, for your answer to that. There's a question from one of our attendees about the wetland. Since wetland receives stormwater flow and serves as a retention basin, why didn't Eagle collect water samples and soil samples from the wetland at the same time the split samples were collected?
Well, first we needed to identify if there's PFAS present, and there was. And the sampling is something we're planning on doing. The township does have its obligations, so, we're hoping they would take that on, and they haven't. So we plan on doing it this summer.
Thanks, Rebecca. Okay, I'll take another hand.
Do you want to answer, Les? It sounds like there's a couple, or at least one question here about why people don't know about this if they're buying houses in the area.
Yes.
And-
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed that one. Yes.
Yeah, I think generally, unless you're buying a house that has contamination on it, other residents, if you're just buying a residential house, aren't obligated to tell you what's in the area. So that's kind of the homework you guys have to do as homeowners or potential purchasers, is to know what's in the area. Realtors do not have that obligation. Realtors have an obligation if they know about contamination at the property you're buying. But it's not their obligation to have to inform you about everything else in the area. So unfortunately, it's not, real easy for people to necessarily find these things out. Now, coming into the age of websites and internet, we have a lot of resources on the MPARTS website as well as Eagle's website about sites of environmental contamination that could give you a lot more information, because a site like this Brighton Township dump would actually be listed on a map and you would have some information. So at least know to start asking some questions. But that's a good question. It's just not something that's been built into our real estate law that you would have to be notified about these kinds of things.
Thank you for answering that, Abby.
Mhm.
I think we answered the question about when was PFOS, PFOA, was it previously sampled? I believe the answer to that was it had not been previously sampled until recently. Rebecca, I think you answered that earlier.
So, and there's
Yes,
one.
there was not a parameter of concern in the consent decree, wasn't sampled. And then when Eagle split samples last May, we found it. So therefore it became a parameter of concern.
Okay. Abby had something to add?
I was just looking at the question about whether or not it's legal to abandon a property
Yes.
with contamination back to the state of Michigan. And unfortunately, it happens quite often with what we call orphan sites, where the party who might own the property either goes bankrupt or dies or whatever, loses it through tax reversion because they don't have enough money to pay for the taxes. And so that stuff ends up tax reverting back to the state and can end up in the land bank, can end up with the state on the tax rolls. And so we kind of claim those as orphan sites. And there's quite a few of them. There's a lot of them. Is it legal? It is kind of part of that process. That doesn't necessarily mean the state always has resources to handle all of them, but they do end up back in that bucket of orphan sites that we've got. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Thanks, Abby. New questions come in, Abby. Abby, can you confirm that a realtor is required to reveal contamination of a specific house when it is being sold?
And I would say yes, if a realtor knows that there's contamination. So if a realtor has information that, the drinking water is impacted, or the house was built over an old dump, or was, there's something actually impacted about that property. If they've got knowledge, it's supposed to be disclosed on the homeowner's disclosure form. And so the realtor and the homeowner then would have those obligations to make sure the new owner knows about it, at least through the business transaction of property purchase. And so, I can't cite the realty law piece of it that it specifically says that, but I do know that they have that obligation to disclose.
Thank you, Abby. I think that's it for the PFAS site specific. You have a hand if we want to take this question. And for others that may have or have questions, you can still feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, or for our individuals that are still on the phone, it's #2 for you to electronically raise your hand if you're on the telephone. And let's see, I'll take this next hand raised.
Yeah, hi,
Oh,
can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is John Ewing. I want to take issue with Ms. Taylor's claim that Brighton Township is not the owner of this property. It was alleged in the federal litigation that it was effectively the owner under certain rules, CERCLA, I think is the acronym, that it controlled the hours, that it had enough participation to consider it controller of the property. Today they have the keys and a gate and they maintain it. So I'm not sure why she says they are not the owner. And particularly in the context of her suggesting that she's not in a position to make legal statements as a project manager. And with respect to the abandonment of the property, let's be honest here. It was abandoned because of the legal liability. Ms. Hendershot made some comments about bankruptcy or other things and how this is all normal. This is a site that was abandoned because they were evading the liability. They were partners with Brighton Township in the liability. So anyway, just want to say that. Lastly, I want to mention you have a setup here that says all questions and questions, but when you go to all questions, it only brings you to the questions you've submitted. I submitted 4, one of them was answered. I don't need to have answers on the other ones. I'll shoot an email to Ms. Taylor on that. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, do we
Okay.
have any other ones, Les?
None that are specific to the investigation.
All right. Yep, and it looks like we put some good stuff in the chat, so I don't see any more hands coming up.
No, I have no new hands raised. And so I guess if Abby, if you or Rebecca or any of the other panelists would like to make some final comments about the investigation, or I know you're still trying to obtain access to homes to sample. So Rebecca, how do people reach out to you? I know you went out going door to door, so how do folks reach out to you?
So far, I have 5 permission to sample forms back. And you can take a picture of the form after you fill it out and scan it and send me an email at taylor.r@michigan.gov, and get you in the queue for when we get our contractor on board to collect the samples, and they will be from the outside spigot, so it's no contact type sampling.
Okay.
But it is important, if you've got neighbors in this area, that you talk to them and tell them it's important that we get this sampling done. We want to get as many of the, homes in the blue dots sampled as possible. And at this point, we've only got 5 so far. So if you can pass the word and let them know that they should have received something from Rebecca, that they can always reach out to her with email and phone too.
Okay. And I just want to remind everyone again that the webinar is recorded, and we will have a copy available and posted on Eagle's YouTube channel, hopefully within the next day or so. And once that's posted, we'll try to get that word out to you. And I think we also have it connected to the Brighton Township dump site on the Impart page as well.
Mhm. Will do.
And with that, Abby, I have nothing further.
All right, excellent. Thank you for joining us. Reach out to us if you have additional questions. Michigan PFAS response or MPART will take you to the MPART site. Like we said, tons of information, but this is an ongoing investigation. So Rebecca will be reaching out to the neighborhood with additional updates. And so stay tuned. Thank you.